In a galaxy where the sea itself is a battlefield, and even the rain whispers prayers to a dying god, a stranger breaches the void. He is not a sanctioned psyker, nor a post-human demigod in ceramite. He is a king, crowned by the ocean, armed with a trident, and fluent in the language of all living waters. This is the tale of what happens when Aquaman is hurled into the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where the tides answer to no one, until now. The sky tore open like a wound and spat him into a storm. He hit the ocean hard enough to make the rain recoil. Pressure closed on him from all sides, the heavy, abyss-born grip of a world that knew nothing of mercy. And for a heartbeat, he was only motion and salt and the clean bite of cold. Then the trident in his hand found the rhythm of the sea, thrummed in his palm like a tuning fork, and the world came into focus. He did not surface right away. He let the depth hold him, let the weight tell him its story. Water here carried iron and ash. It sang in mineral chords. Under his tongue, he tasted volcanoes. Far below, vents breathed black smoke into cathedral-dark canyons where cities clung like barnacles to basalt ribs. Ropes of cultivated kelp swayed in patient rituals, tended by machines that wore rosaries of rust. A continent of weather marched above. Cyclones braided into gyres, glassy eyes of calm at their centers like coins set in scars. And beyond the low clouds, something vast moved. Ships, steel-boned and prayer-scratched, dragging contrails of ignorant and burnished wrath. He rose, breaking the surface into a world painted in gunmetal and flame. Waves shouldered against a black glass shore, half devoured by the storm. Lightning stitched the horizon to the sea with needlework too fast to see. In the distance, a flotilla of floating habs huddled together where the swells were gentler. Domes lacquered in algae and devotional script, buttressed by pylons that vanished into the deep. They were linked by corridors of woven kelp stretched taut as drumskin, their undersides furred with filter colonies that drank the current. Picked totems flickered in the rain, saints and skulls and the sigils of a vast, pious bureaucracy he did not know. He knew something else instead. He knew the sea. It pressed in, not a single mind, but a parliament of them. 1,000 hungers and habits and ancestral memories layered into a living archive. It spoke to him in the language of pressure, in the tremor signatures of fin and bone, in the coil and release of the tide. He listened. He answered back. The answering was simple, as it had always been. He thought in currents, and currents moved. He strode out of the foam and onto the shore. The sand here was obsidian grit that glittered like night poured into grains. Wind knifed the spray sideways. Above, one of the ships banked, a slab-sided dagger with ribs of light, broadside cannons hungry in their housings. Voices rode the storm on tight beams of static, clipped, ritual-laced commands, invocations tucked between coordinates. He did not understand the words, but knew the cadence of people who had made their faith into a tool. Movement dragged his gaze down coast. Skimmers knifed across the waves, too fast to be anything but arrogant. They moved like predators that had never learned to fear. Long humming blades wore water like a cloak. Their hulls were saw-tooth shadows that seemed to break the eye that looked at them. Where they passed, water screamed in a frequency too high for human ears, and he felt a shudder go through the fish below, like a flock flinching at a hawk's shadow. They were headed for the flotilla, for the people clinging to it. And they were not alone. Sleeker shapes unlatched from the storm itself, thin, elegant boats that floated on knives and bad intentions, and arced toward the kelp corridors with lines already uncoiling, barbed, beautiful things made to taste blood. He did not ask who they were. He had learned long ago that you do not need a name for a threat to meet it. He ran. The shore buckled under the storm, slick and slanted, but he moved like the tide does when it decides that no wall is high enough. Salt stung his face. The wind tried to take the breath from his mouth, and the trident answered with a hum down its length that said, "No." He hit the water in a sprint and let the surface break around his knees, his waist, his chest until the ocean took him entirely and made him its equal. Speed came not from effort, but from agreement. Muscles burned, yes, but they burned in a way that fit the grain of things. He was a shadow below the chop, a pale comet trailing a whip of bubbles. The flotilla swelled larger, carried by the breathing of the sea. Through its slatted belly and the forest of pylons, he saw people moving in the blue-green light. Figures, sealed in hard suits, others in oilskin. Custodians with harpoons older than their scars. Children tied to elder belts by could so they would not be lost. Alarm beacons smoldered red behind algae-smeared glass. The smell of ozone and hot metal filmed the water. The first skimmer slashed into the kelp corridor and set it howling with flame. Fire webbed across wet plant and stuck there as if the burning were a concept rather than a chemistry. Figures tumbled from the corridor into the water, their straps cutting clean lines in the skin of the sea. The skimmer slewed to keep the corridor between it and the floating hab, twin lances opening like eyes to spit light. The light carved the underside of the hab and set resin weeping. Screams turned tinny, filtered by suit radios, by prayer. Aquaman rose directly in the path of the skimmer. It came on anyway. The pilot inside was a suggestion of angles and hunger behind a hood of mirrored glass. Their craft was arrogant enough to expect any resistance to be ornamental. He put the trident into the wave and levered. The wave, eager to please, obliged. Water lifted like a door slamming open. The skimmer knifed into a wall that had not been there a heartbeat before, and the wall caught it, held it, rolled it with an interest not entirely human. Metal protested in high, expensive notes. The craft came down on its side at the edge of a kelp lattice and tried to sprint away, but their knives slid off currents that had decided to be stone. He saw the pilot stagger and drag a weapon from the console, designed to fold bodies neatly. The trident came up and spoke, once, in a register that made teeth ache. The weapon shattered like spun sugar. The pilot looked at him, and he saw the precise moment a creature that had never been refused wanted to redefine reality, to escape the refusal. He did not allow it. He put 2 fingers under the craft, found the seam at the keel, and lifted. He was not a giant. He was not a machine. He was simply someone who could ask the ocean to help him stand. The skimmer tipped, flipped, and went under. It writhed against the water. The water accepted its writhing the way a grave accepts a trespasser. On the periphery of the flotilla, more knives kissing the sea streaked toward the domes, firing lines that didn't arc or sag or miss. People yanked from corridors as if they were fish, and the raiders were gods with hooks. He did not split his mind. Splitting was a way to be less than needed. He handed the immediate peril to something bigger than himself. "Leviathans," he said without words. "Old ones, children, hunters. Hear me." They had been listening since he arrived. Humps and ridges moved in the gloom. Living reefs armored in chitin and scar. Lamp-jawed titans that cruised trenches like submarines with memories. There were spiral-shelled monarchs that exhaled steam through cathedral horns. There were silver cords of eels that wrote cursive lightning through cold water. There were plankton swarms that thought in chorus and liked the taste of copper. Farther down, something older flexed in its sleep. The slow muscle of a thing that knew seasons measured in deaths of continents. "Come up," he asked them, "because the sea is hurt." They came. The first to answer were the lampjaws, long as gunboats and patient as tides. They rose with their lures extinguished, mouths closed. They were not what he needed first. He needed speed, and he needed spines. The reefbacks obliged, hulks with backs grown sharp with mineral gardens, whose lives were a collaboration between rock and hunger. They surged under the skimmers and turned up just enough to introduce armor to underbelly. Boats that had carved water like silk hit unexpected geology and discovered the humility of physics. More skimmers tried to vault. He asked the current to kink the way a muscle knots when struck, and it did. The vault became a flail. The elegant arcs of the raiders wobbled, then panicked. A silver page of eels wrote itself between two craft, closed the loop, and both fizzled like bad miracles, their power gutters coughing out. He breached again next to a corridor where fire still crawled. The fire was an appetite wearing a flame's clothing. It did not drown when water pleaded with it the usual way. He set the trident's tines into the burning net and pushed, not with force but with definition. Water is what it is, because it is not something else. He reminded the corridor of being wet. The fire had no category left to wear. It sighed out as if annoyed. People stared at him through fogged visors. One tore off a glove and pressed their palm to a pane, the universal gesture of thanks from behind glass. He nodded, then vanished again, because there was still work to do. He broke into the Hab's underbelly, where pump hymns rattled through pipes and the slant light was green and gold. Through the floor, he felt another kind of movement. Small, precise, mechanical. A blade slipped under the skin. Raiders had cut entrance holes into the pylons and were crawling up inside like ticks. He shouldered through a maintenance hatch into water that smelled of machine oil and found figures in skins of matte black and quicksilver, their hands full of trophies and hooks. One lifted a weapon that drew a straight, unkind line between them. He did not parry. He closed the distance in a single heartbeat, took the weapon apart with his hands, and put the fragments where they would tear nothing and no one. The raider went to knives. He went to elbows, to the heel of his palm, to the way water makes even a heavy body graceful when it is asked kindly. He did not linger. He did not hate. He did not have time for either. Above, the ships had noticed. On the bridge of the nearest frigate, a dozen eyes turned to a single hololith where the sea translated itself into lines and murmurs. Temperature shifts, salinity blooms, sonar ghosts of vast things moving with intent. Servitors burbled litany data. A robed figure with metal where a face had been measured out of spec harmonics and frowned in a language of gears. A junior officer touched the charm at their throat and whispered something that made courage organize itself in their chest. The captain, a woman with ritual scars like crow's feet and a voice that could cut a fog bank, watched the ruin of the attackers, and said very little. She had learned that too many words can insult a miracle. Biosigns, multiple, converging on hostile craft, one of the Vox adepts said, half a prayer and half a report. Current behavior is intentional. Intentional, the captain echoed, tasting the word. By whose will? No one had the answer. In the absence of a name, Navy's right one. They marked the phenomenon on the hololith with a sigil the color of seawater and the shape of a spear. Below, he moved from crisis to crisis, the way a heart moves blood. He cut lines. He gave breath to the drowning. He lent momentum to the harpoons of men who had only prayed to hit. He caught a child by the strap before the ocean kept her, and placed her back into arms that shook too hard to lift. He asked a swarm of plankton to glow bright as festival lanterns in a tunnel, so people would not die of the dark while they fled. He told a monstrous, chitin-armored old thing to let go of a skimmer hull, because while he appreciated the sentiment, teeth did not need to teach this particular lesson. At the edge of the battle, one raider boat outpaced the current's cleverness and made for open water, where a rendezvous shimmered, an ugly syllable in the storm, the hint of a door half open to somewhere worse. He gave the sea his breath in a wordless gift, and the sea returned it to him as speed. The distance closed to nothing. He met the boat in a low arc and landed on its spine. For a moment, the craft and he were a single, beautiful animal running together across the skin of the world. Then he set the trident in a seam and pulled. The seam opened like a mouth. The boat remembered it was only parts. Water, delighted, rushed in to rearrange confusion into stillness. The door at the horizon thought better of itself and closed. Silence did not arrive so much as it built itself, shy and incremental, around the edges of catastrophe. The storm's voice came back into focus. The ordinary tyranny of rain, the simple cruelty of wind. The flotilla hung on its anchors, abraded but unbroken. The corridors sagged, blackened along one flank but still spanning the gap between life and deeper water. Survivors counted each other with lips and hands. The kelp's singed skin began to put out new fronds because growth is what it knows to do when nothing is actively stopping it. A bell tolled from within the main dome, and the sound wove itself into the ocean's hum without apology. He climbed back onto the obsidian shore. The trident's humming softened, settled into the bones of his hand like a cat on a windowsill watching rain. He watched the sea breathe, listened to the aftertaste of violence as it dispersed through currents and muscle. What he felt through the water was not gratitude. It was older than that. The sea does not thank. It accepts, and in accepting, it gives places to stand. Above, engines shifted pitch. The frigate that had watched began to descend, cautious as a hawk that suspects the rabbit is a trap. Skiffs peeled away from its flanks, blunt-nosed and bristling, lights probing the rain. Crests and sigils gleamed on armor. Men and women inside those skiffs had a zeal that could be mistaken for serenity, unless you had fought beside zeal before. They came ashore in a careful wedge, weapons lowered but not low, eyes moving the way eyes move when they have learned to survive by noticing very small things very early. One of them wore a badge shaped like a skull biting a star. Another had a book chained to their chest. The leader's cloak was heavy with salt that did not dare stain it. He understood none of the specifics, but knew authority when it presented itself. They stopped a respectful distance away. The leader regarded him with a scholar's curiosity and a hunter's restraint. Behind their visor, a mouth set to hymns did not quite know what to sing. A vox clicked. Static lifted its head and spoke in a measured, official tone that did not so much ask as make room for an answer to arrive if it wanted. "Unregistered asset," the voice said. "Identify." He looked at them, then looked past them to the flotilla and the great, slow swell of the living world. He did not speak the names he had been called in other places. They did not fit here yet. Instead, he planted the trident in the shore's black glass. The sound it made was small and sure and traveled farther than sound ought to, down through stone and into the water where all announcements are catalogued. "I'm here," he said simply. Somewhere distant on the ship, decisions began to braid themselves into orders. Fear and wonder argued behind closed lips. A runner sealed in brass and belief sprinted for a transceiver that smelled like burned prayers. Above the bridge, a sanctified dish turned on its canted spine and sipped the storm for a slender slice of silence. A message threaded itself along that filament into the wider, busier dark. To those who listen for oddities in a galaxy addicted to them, it said, "Something has come up from the water and made the impossible look domestic." On a slate polished by machine and faith, a new line joined old litanies. Origin, Pelagia Prime. Category, unclassified. Behavioral summary, command authority over macrobiome, thalassic. Psychic index, indeterminate, anecdotal. Imperial asset loss prevented, significant. Recommend, investigation, containment, contact. It went to those who collect anomalies, the way fishermen collect legends. It went in due course to a seal that had not been broken in years. The seal belonged to an organization that does not enjoy being surprised. The rain kept falling. The sea kept breathing. On the shore, a man with a crown only water could see stood with a weapon that was older than the words around him and listened to a world that had decided he belonged to it. On the horizon, a new storm gathered itself. It did not smell like weather. It smelled like questions in black coats. They put him in a cathedral made of iron and vacuum, and then they took the sound out of it. Not all of it. Engines still hummed. Icons still rattled on their chains when the ship hit a rough slab of air. But a specific sound, the background choir the ocean always sang inside him, went thin as a paper cut. Across the threshold stood women with shaven scalps and eyes like flint under frost. The mere fact of them smoothed the noise of the world into a flat line. They wore their silence the way the ship wore armor. He had never been afraid of quiet. The sea had taught him all its dialects. This was different. This quiet did not listen back. They escorted him through lit corridors printed with prayers. Each archway bore sigils hammered by generations of hands that wanted to bind what the galaxy refused to hold. Servo skulls drifted in the half-light like anxious thoughts. Cherubs of wax and wire pulled beads through little rosaries, muttering in voices too small to believe. Ahead walked the Inquisitor. She did not dress like the officers, though they made room for her without being told. Her coat was the color of old blood, her rosette a small starburst at her throat. Scar tissue cross-hatched one cheek in a map not quite human, not quite ritual. When she spoke, the ship seemed to adjust its posture to hear her better. "You speak to water," she said as they walked. It wasn't a question. "Water speaks to me," he answered. A corner of her mouth tugged, not humor, not disdain, something like noted. The Ordo Xenos concerns itself with things that do not belong. I am considering the possibility that the sea is among them. The sea belongs to itself, he said. She accepted that, too. For the duration of this assessment, you are an unsanctioned asset. You will not be harmed unless you merit it. You will not be freed unless you earn it. If you attempt escape, this ship will abandon every other priority to end you. Do you understand? I understand the habit of empires, he said. I'll stay. The Sisters of Silence bracketed him tighter, as if they could make understanding into compliance by proximity. Their aura was a cold front moving through a warm body, a pressure change that left the tongue tasting metal. He reached for the ocean and found it, but far away, as if on the other side of a wall as clean as polished bone. A whisper answered him, silt-dusted. The whisper was enough. They took him to a room that had been built for certainties. Hexagrammic wards stitched the floor in sharp angles. Silver nails pinned prayers into the walls. A tank occupied the center, like an altar. It was full of water drawn from the planet below. Their attempt at home field advantage. The water sloshed. The sisters didn't look at it. They refused to look at anything that might have an opinion. A Magos Biologis was waiting, half man and half machine, in unequal conversation. Cables came and went from ports under his ribs. His hands were surgeon steady and wrong. His voice ran on a different rhythm, as if it had been tuned to a clock and never retuned to life. Empirical inquiry, the Magos said. Indexing anomalous subject with non-Sekana macroscopic biosphere influence. Null field control present. He gestured with a finger that ended in a prong. Submerge. Actuate capacity. We will measure the deltas. You want me to talk, he said, with all your friends in the room that hates talking. Control variables, the Magos said. Repeatability is the spine of truth. He stepped up onto the lip of the tank and looked down. The water returned his gaze. It was not Pelagia's open mercies. It was filtered and disciplined, pipe broken and technician tamed. Still, it was water. He slipped in. The silence tightened like a fist. The sisters watched without watching. Their eyes were on him, but not engaged, their attention a blank blade. The Inquisitor stood on the warded tiles with her hands behind her back, a patient executioner. The Magos hung small machines in the air over the tank. They ticked and blinked and drank readings like predatory fish. He reached for the water in his bones before the water in the tank. It was habit, the way one might flex a hand to remember it. Messages came back, skin, blood, salt, irritated by the null aberrations at the room's edge. He reached past his own tide to the tanks. The sister's aura swallowed noise, possibility, heat from the conversation. His link dimmed to a thread. Threads hold. He projected a simple imperative. Be calm. The water loosened. The surface lost its ruffles. He shaped a slow current against the steel wall and watched it cradle the sensors like wary fish. The Magos made interested insect sounds. Psychana activity negative, one of the servo cherubs intoned, grafted litanies hiccuping. Phenomenology, fluid dynamic manipulation without warp signature. A trick, said a man in a scholar's hood at the back, an aide whose jaw clenched on his skepticism like a dog on a bone. Magnets, hidden baffles, acts of stagecraft. Observe, the Magos said, unfazed. He adjusted one of the nulls with a gesture. A sister stepped closer. The world got thinner. It hurt. Not in the way a wound hurts, that knows origin and aims toward healing. This hurt belonged to subtraction. The water's voice went off key. He could still hear it, like a song remembered after the instruments stop. He thought the current into a circle anyway, and the circle obeyed, ragged-edged. The sisters were absence made human. His gift was a kind of presence. The competition sanded him down. Fascinating, the Magos whispered, and the word was almost worship. He uses tangible parameters as carriers. Pressure vectors, acoustic artifacts, resonance. He does not reach through the immaterium. I told you, the scholar said. A trick. The Inquisitor made a small cutting motion, and the scholar went still, as if she had clipped his string. Show me something that cannot be faked, she said. He thought about that. He could flood the room, break the tank, twist the air with the water's help, demonstrate force. Force was persuasive to the weak-minded. It wasn't what she had asked for. He laid the trident along the tank's edge and set its tines into the water like a tuning fork barely touching glass. Then he drew in a breath, and out on the out-breath he hummed. It would have been absurd, a king humming to an instrument in a different place. Here, the sound he made met the trident's metal, and the trident took it apart and returned it clean. The water took that clean note and repeated it until the room held only one idea. Be this exactly. Wards flickered. Silver nails sang. Servo skulls shivered in their housings. The null's aura grabbed at the note and found it had nothing to hold. It was not a warp thing, not an emotion, not a sin. It was definition, as bare as math. The Magos' instruments spiked, then normalized, then spiked again, as if unsure of what constituted normal. His mecha dendrites twitched like antennae in rain. The inarticulate scholar reached for the nearest explanation. Ventriloquism of metal. Quiet, the Inquisitor said, and this time it wasn't a gesture. He took the trident away. The sound died. The water went back to being the element most comfortable at pretending it is simple. They gave him other tests. They raised the null field until his teeth ached and asked him to command a jar of jelly things that had been dragged up from under 3 miles of pressure. He soothed them. They replaced the nulls with a psyker, trembling with too much self, eyes bruised with stars, behind 6 layers of brass and confession. The psyker retched at his proximity, then quieted against him as if they had been left in his care. They set cages of razorfish in the tank and asked him to make them sleep. He did. They asked him to wake a fossil. He refused. Why? The Inquisitor asked. Because the sea knows when to keep its dead, he said. You respect that, or you stop deserving to live by it. It might have been his first true mistake, or his first true test. The Inquisitor watched his face like a shoreline watches weather. She marked something down in her mind. The alarm found them before the arguments did. Not the low-level background panic of any Imperial warship. A thick, honest alarm that could be a color if you had the wrong kind of brain. Vox channels opened like wounds. The ship's crew prayed between coordinates again, and this time the prayers did not sound like habit. Polar shelf breach, a disembodied voice reported, trembling with surety. Anomaly rising under Sector Gorgon. Auspex returns corrupted. Tithe domes in that grid broadcasting distress litanies and praise equals panic equations. Unknown biologic. The Magos' head tilted as if something far away had tugged a cable through his skull. Pattern noise suggests immaterium bleed through. Another voice joined, steady as a keel. Naval, not theological. Cold currents are reversing. We are losing the trenches. The Inquisitor's eyes found him and did not pretend it was an accident. She did not hurry, but the room took its speed from her. How long to put boots on ice? 10 minutes for a lander, said the officer, materializing at the threshold with the efficiency of bad news. Longer for proper rites. The Inquisitor considered rites and weighed them against drowning. Sisters. With me. Margos, bring your lies. Asset --. I heard, he said. You're bringing the silence? A cordon, she said. If it is a warp thing, we will strangle its song. If it is not, we will learn something before we die. They outfitted him in a suit because even kings must compromise with cold. He shrugged it on and let them seal it, but left the head thrown back. He needed to hear water without him. The sisters watched the bare skin of his throat as if it were a blasphemy. He met the eyes of one, pale as a winter sky, and accepted how she refused to be present for him. It was pure and terrible. The lander dropped them into weather that had forgotten it was supposed to be air. Snow came sideways like a decision. The polar shelf rose out of the world as an instruction. The ice was blue with old time. Cathedrals had been carved into it by heat and patience. The sea exhaled through them the way a sleeping beast exhales through its teeth. Beyond the shelf, the ocean simmered with a wrong temperature. He walked to the edge. The sisters formed a line behind him like the outline of a blade. One knelt and drove a ward iron into the ice. Another lifted her hands and made a shape, the swift, exact grammar of the voiceless, that meant danger is not a reason to abandon form. He nodded without looking back. Courtesy mattered. Below, something moved under the ice, the way a thought moves under a face. He could feel it without being told by any sensor. It was not a creature in the way the sea had taught him to understand creatures. It was a circumstance with a pulse. The water around it wore oil that did not come from any machine. It was slick with idea. He went in. The cold made teeth in his bones and bit. He set it aside. Depth took him and he accepted it. Above, through the muted white of the ice's underbelly, the sisters' silhouettes cut a contour of absence. Their aura reached down like winter. The warp slick recoiled from it, but also tried to paint itself around it, inventing shapes to survive. He swam toward the thing at the center. The water did not mind being water. It minded being asked to be something else. Where the slick touched it, the molecules rearranged into little lies. Fish that should have fled like birds in the shadow of a hawk, spasmed and turned themselves into bad copies that forgot to breathe. He gathered the ones that still remembered enough of themselves to obey, and pushed them away with the softest part of his will. The Kraken cracked the ice above with a slow, smiling motion. That is what it felt like. A smile that never touched eyes. It was big enough to matter in a world where Su is the first line of argument. Tentacles wound in and out of a geometry that possessed corners only when you looked away. In its flesh were windows, portholes into nothing that looked at him with shipwreck light. The water around it tasted like iron, incense, and lies. He would have named it a thing born of dreams if the dreams he knew had ever smelled of prayer. He gave it his name instead. He did not speak, but names are not always sound. He told it, "You are Kraken," which is to say, you are animal, which is to say, you are allowed to be killed. Tentacles moved, water churned. A suckered arm, bigger than a column, swept at him. He moved the way a current moves when it decides a rock is a suggestion. The trident wrote a narrow, precise line through the slick, and the slick parted unwillingly. He didn't stab. Stabbing is just a louder way to say no. He set the tines against a band of flesh and pressed the way you press a key that knows a song. The metal hummed. The ice hummed back. The water chose the note and followed it. Sound in water is not sound as air understands it. It is pressure made articulate. His note found the parts of the kraken that had been encouraged to exist by attention rather than biology, and unmade the encouragement. Not an exorcism, a correction. The creature shuddered. Its windows went dull. It tried to become more itself, and in doing so, it revealed how little self it possessed. From above, the Null's winter deepened. Their presence shaved sivers of possibility off the slick until the slick had fewer lies to wear. The warped oil thinned, bled into the ocean like ink that cannot find the paper where it belongs. Another arm descended, slower, heavier, full of confession. He took it and twisted with everything the sea had taught him about leverage. A geyser of cold shot up through a fissure and froze mid-breath. He saw, just for a heartbeat, a city on the shelf's edge. Dome windows fogged with fear, a child's palm on a pane. He wondered if it was the same child he had saved. He struck the trident again. The tuning fork answer was cleaner this time. The ice steadied, as if remembering that it is the mineral form of patience. The Margot's vox in his ear, he had forgotten they had given him a vox, crackled alive with involuntary awe. Spectrography indicates impossible. Resonance aligning lattice structures outside acceptable variance. The water, he is persuading the water to be water harder. The Inquisitor's voice arrived like a blade carefully sheathed. Finish it. He could have killed the kraken by breaking it into meat. He didn't. He peeled warp off it, the way you peel something you love out of something you hate. Beneath the slick was an animal that had been made to be a door. He closed the door and told the animal, "Go down and remember you were only hungry." It looked at him with one bright, changed eye, then uncoiled until it was a silhouette, and then a rumor, and then gone. Where the slick had touched, the water shuddered as if it remembered the wrong pattern and wanted to throw it up. He set the trident against that memory and sang a note that told the ocean, "Take your time, nothing is chasing you." When he climbed back onto the ice, steam walked off him in little lies the cold made. The sisters had not moved. He didn't know if they had prayed. It would not have been with words if they had. One of them, pale-eyed, winter sky, stepped forward. She lifted her hands and signed, "You are difficult to classify." He signed back, clumsy with the language, a thing made of guesswork and courtesy. "So I am the sea." The Margots arrived with instruments that had forgotten their jobs and tried to remember them all at once. "No warp signature," he declared, shaking with the joy of being wrong in a new way. "No draw on immaterium. The null field attenuated his effect without collapsing it. He is not a psyker. He is an engineer of reality at the scale of fluid." "Poet," the scholar muttered, but there was less bite in it. "Salt witch. Tidemonger." "King," someone said softly, and no one admitted to having said it. The Inquisitor studied him, the way a hunter studies a thing they cannot eat. Her gaze was not a kindness. It was an admission that kindness is an inefficient tool. You obeyed, she said. You acted. You understand that I can have you unmade if you become inconvenient. Yes, he said. You understand also that I cannot afford to waste a lever that moves the ocean. He looked past her to the shelf, to the fogging domes, to the long, dark line of the sea. You have many words for power, he said. Very few for obligation. Teach me one, she said. Steward, he said. It means you hold a thing for those who come after. Not for yourself, not for your master, for the thing and its future. She weighed it. The sister's silence made even the weighing feel like sacrilege. Finally, she inclined her head, not in submission, never that, but in recognition that a new term had entered the lexicon of her war. Conditional sanction, she said to the air, which meant to the ship, which meant to the network of faith and force that obeyed her. Asset to operate under seal of Thalassa, escort in triplicate, null presence within 2 arm spans when possible. Observation continuous. The pale-eyed sister made a tiny face that might have been distaste at proximity, might have been humor. He couldn't tell. He found that he wanted to. Do you chain everything you don't understand? He asked. When it threatens to drown my species, the Inquisitor said without apology. We call it civilization. He accepted the chain and stood up anyway. The trident was easy in his hand, heavy with clean notes that had not yet cooled. The null's aura slid up against his skin as they formed around him. Salt and silence, winter and tide. He was no psyker. He was something else that had learned how to keep being itself when the world around it had opinions. On the way back to the lander, the wind went still for the first time, the way it sometimes does when a storm changes its mind. For a second, there was a sound under the ice that he had not heard since he arrived. A deep, ancient purr. The sea cleared its throat in gratitude or indigestion. With oceans, it is sometimes the same. He tilted his head like an animal listening to a master's footstep and smiled without showing his teeth. On the ship, Victor's reports began to breed in the Vox net, dressing the thing he had done in the clothes bureaucracy keeps for miracles. On a desk somewhere, a file took a new name, Trial of Salt and Silence. Under that, a line. The sisters cannot name what he is. Under that, another line. We cannot ignore what he can do. The nulls walked beside him, and the quiet walked with them, and he made room for it the way the sea makes room for a stone, by flowing past, not by pretending the stone is water. Dusk on Pelagia is an hour-long held breath. The storms dim to a bruised violet. The kelp forests fold their fronds like tired hands, and the abyssal cities will light their chimneys and lanterns. On that evening, the breath never let out. The sky turned granular and began to fall. At first, it looked like dark snow. Then the flakes revealed themselves as seeds with teeth. Mycetic spores punched the ocean like fists of rotten fruit. Each impact threw up a crown of water and a chemical sigh. Inside the sigh were mandibles. He felt the panic arrive before the first alarms. Not human panic. Currents going off beat, schooling patterns unraveling. The reef mines mongering confusion through their calcium telegraph. The sea told him what it never had words for. Hurt, wrong, hunger in a key that wasn't allowed. He told it back. I hear you. And then, to the ship in orbit that had made him a file with seals and cautions. They're here. The Vox fed him the bridge's breathing. Commands went out with prayer jammed into the spaces between coordinates. All batteries stand to. Scrubbers to full intake. Shield the domes. fireboats to Lattice 4. Somewhere behind the clipped-voiced officers, he heard the Inquisitor say nothing in a way that simplified everyone else. The first spores opened before they sank. Chitin flowered. Sacks deflated. Limbs unfolded with the comfortable confidence of a tool finding its task. Termagants spilled out like inventory. Their guns were parts of them and happy about it. Ripper swarms unrolled like barbed carpets across the waves and began to reduce everything that wasn't them into them. Fatter pods plummeted deeper and burped out things written for water. Gill-slitted swimmers with scythe fins, lamprey-mouthed belchers that gulped water, proofed it in sacks, and exhaled darts. Eel-sleek lictors that vanished into gloom and then reappeared where terror would be most efficient. Shadow in the warp increasing, a vox tech whispered like a sin. Astropathic choir is distorted. The sisters stood on the command deck like winter candles. Their silence couldn't cancel the shadow, but it took the high whine out of it, shaved the fear down to something with edges. He nodded toward them without turning. Their presence would tighten him later. For now, the distance softened their winter to weather he could work in. He dove on the first splash, and the ocean welcomed him like a host who has been watching the driveway all afternoon. He did not go alone. He went with a plan the sea could enact. The trenches here were geography and dynasty, mile-deep wounds with history layered in silt. He mapped them the way a shepherd maps wind, where it breaks, where it tunnels, where it sings. He told the currents to kink and the thermoclines to hold. He invited cold rivers to tumble down the contours like polished ball bearings and hot chimneys to exhale as one. Around the nearest dome city, he folded a low-pressure bulwark until the surface above went glassy despite the storm. He taught the rips to run in loops and the loops to wait for a signal. He painted a picture on the water no eye could see, and every fin would feel. "Targeting solutions updated," an officer murmured topside, seeing their range tables slither toward advantage. "What did that?" "Use it," the Inquisitor said. The first wave of swimmers hit his minefield of nothing and lost definition. Scythe fins slashed at water that wasn't there a moment ago, then was, then wasn't, and overcommitted. The loop current took them by the waist like a judo artist and put them where the reef backs waited. The reef backs came up out of trenches that had been their cathedrals since before Pelagia chose a name for itself. Their backs were mineral gardens bristling with stone thorns and scavenger colonies. Their eyes were old. They did not understand Tyranids. They understood collision. 30 tons of reef first met 6 tons of chitin you could boast about at a brood feast, and converted it into proof that boasting is a bad habit. He swam under a lictor and plucked it by the mask of spined skin it wore over its head. It writhed, emptied itself into an array of blades, found water in all the ways it had not prepared for, and did like a knot coming undone. He felt bad only in the way a surgeon feels bad for a tumor. The sea had room for hunger, but not for hunger that did not join the choir. Tyranids sang only themselves. "Kraken biomorphs confirmed," the Margos said in his ear, and managed to make reverence sound like a footnote. "Subspecies unknown, recording. Spores punched through the surface in the mid-shelf and exhaled uglier things. Brood nodes rooted themselves in the silt and began to garden, rising, pulsing towers that melted clean water to nutrient broth. The broth called rippers, rippers called gaunts, gaunts called worse. He needed to starve the call before the word synapse finished spelling itself. He did not have a planet killer. He had something else, a planet willing to be asked. He rose to the skin of the sea and looked along the horizon at the weather. 3 cyclones lived out there, busy with their private mythologies. Alone, each would spin, batter, and go elsewhere. Together, placed by a hand that understood their stubbornness, they could braid. He touched the trident to the water and hummed a note so low it lived more in spine than ear. He told the cyclones a story about union. Wind is a fluid that forgot it is water. It took the hint well. The 3 storms reached for each other with their wakes and their eyes, then locked fingers. The superstructure of air shuddered, then stood. The ocean beneath agreed to be pulled. The gyre took shape like a crown tilted over the shelf. At its rim, the waves ran like war horses. Toward the center, they began to fall. Anything near the brood nodes found itself sliding toward an argument with gravity it had never had to have. Rippers tried to eat the problem and discovered the problem was longer than their mouths. Brood towers rooted themselves harder and pulled up their own foundations. Chiton squealed like wet glass. "By the throne," said the ship's captain. Not prayer, just engineering shock. "He's made the weather join the navy." "Fire on the outside lane," the Inquisitor said. "Drive them in." Torch ships roared along the rim and laid sheets of promethium in lines the wind admired and apparatus sanctified. Depth charges walked the gradient like beads on a rosary. Macro batteries on the frigates found their rhythms improved by a man who turned water into a drum. The creatures that were made for air complained. Harridans and crones swept low to vomit spore mines and got their bellies slapped by gusts that forgot how to be polite. Gargoyles came in screaming and left as chips of chitin in spray. A harpy got a mouthful of flame and decided to be a cliff in the worst possible place. The sea did not prefer fire, but it enjoyed being asked to host a clever trick. Underwater, the fight got close and mean. Tyranids do not stop. They become different versions of themselves and continue. Long-bodied things with fin blades learned to shear through tiger kelp, so the kelp learned to draw tight. Skulking things with mantis claws learned the cadence of patrolling custodians' lamps, so the custodians changed their songs. A trigon crashed into a chimney city that hung like a chandelier under a basalt shelf. Its coils were thick as alleys and armored in a story that called itself inevitability. He met it in a corridor where the water knew him, and he knew the water. The trigon struck in a straight line, because that is what snakes do when they forget they are dancers. He made the corridor 2 inches narrower for a heartbeat. The trigon learned humility. It tried again with more teeth. He took its momentum, wrapped it, and handed it to the thermal vent below. The vent obliged with a pulse that scalded biological intent into biological memory. Reefbacks weren't the only allies. The lamp jaws took their lures out like lanterns in a blackout and draped them over contacts that needed breaking. A snap, a pressure kiss, and the lights went out with the targets attached. Eels wrote cursive lightning through schools of feeder gants until those schools wrote themselves back into nothing. An old queen of the Bath hypelagic, armored in barnacles that were temples to patience, rose under a sinking brood nest with a speed she had not admitted she still owned, and lifted it into the gyre's throat. She did not do it for him. She did it because something had asked her to be exactly what she was, in the one moment it mattered. The Tyranids adapted. They always do. A second wave of spores detonated into foam-bellied floats whose job was to sow themselves into a battlefield. The baffles ate energy and returned it as boredom. Currents dulled. The gyre staggered. Slender worms with sore faces undulated along the kelp's anchor bundles and chewed. In the trenches, a new strain of synapse beast swam in, pulsing a command frequency like a lighthouse. Where its will reached, the swarm got less stupid. "Node identified," the Margot said. "Frequency 14.2 kilocycles. If he kills that, the local coordination will degrade by—" "Enough!" the captain snapped. He had already felt it. The synapse creature's will was a bruise in the water, a pressure that bullied instead of asked. He headed for it with the trident low and the sea eager. Between him and it, a cloud descended. Rippers, rippers, and more rippers, until the water was teeth with ambitions. He could have burned them with cavitation, but cavitation takes delicate rooms out of ships, and he might need those rooms later. Instead, he told the water. Forget they exist. The current slewed, the laminar flow unstitched. Rippers rely on certainty. They became crumbs. The synapse beast presented itself like a priest who expects to be believed. It was a cylinder of ribbed muscle with a skull embedded at its front like a rosary bead. Along its flanks, bioluminescent organs spasmed messages. It attempted to talk to his mind the way a man yells at a mountain. The shadow of its call scuffed his thoughts and slid off. He set the trident on its hide and pushed a note that said, "You are too loud." Its lights flickered. He said it again, quieter. It died as if embarrassed. On the surface, the three cyclones, braided, began to precess around a barrel of air. The gyre deepened until the shelf creaked. He felt that creak and relented. You do not break a planet to win a battle. He bled the gyre's hunger down the trench in a long, harmless river that would take weeks to forget it had been more. The Navy learned him quickly. Depth charges started to go off exactly where his loops would throw the wounded. Torpedoes arrived at angles the Tyranids hadn't met before, because they were angles that belonged to water, not to lines drawn on a hololith. A lance battery learned to slash across the top of a wave at the precise moment a harpy would be falling through it. Pilots laughed in that particular way. Men and women laugh when something terrifying and beautiful is happening and they are helping it happen. There was ground combat, too, if you can call a lattice of kelp and resin ground. Gaunts found ladders into the dome's underbellies. Custodians met them with harpoons they had blessed with grease and dedication. Children hid in ballast tanks and sang with the plankton to keep the dark small. In a corridor licked by chemical fire, a genestealer came through a maintenance hatch and made 4 arms worth of obvious arguments. A sister of silence who had grudged herself within 2 arm spans of him, pale-eyed, winter sky, stepped in and made 3 gestures. Deflect, reduce, end. The genestealer discovered what happens when you remove certainty from a predator. He covered her flank with a ripple that set the beast's balance wrong for just long enough. She did not thank him. He did not ask for it. They worked. The Tyranids sent their opinion about subtlety, a hierophant that had learned to swim. It came in segments the size of streets, arachnid legs reimagined as paddles, thorax ribbed to flex against pressure, an abdomen festooned with vents that drank and exhaled like a blacksmith's lungs. Its biocannons spoke in syllables that buckled water and made it cavitate in place. Bubbles popped like landmines. Itdoff and the ocean tried to decide whether it had to make room for this thing. He asked it not to. He gathered the vents along a volcanic avenue like a choir and brought them up in staggered exhalations. The pulses met the Hierophant's rhythm half a beat off, then half again. It tried to compensate. The water lied. Its cannons blew early and gave themselves nosebleeds. Reefbacks charged. The old queen came up again and bit the soft place where abdomen met the vestigial third heart. Things with pretensions to godhood bleed, and the sea knows what to do with blood. He took the trident in both hands and set himself against the Hierophant's skull the way you set a post against a flood. He did not stab. He struck a note that reached through cartilage and into whatever idea this creature used for self. It tried to adapt. He changed the note. It tried to learn. He asked the water to be patient and relentless at once. The Biotitan thrashed, threw shadows like storms, and then lost the conversation. It rolled belly up and sank in a slow spiral that will haunt fish gossip for a century. "Mark that," the Margos whispered, breathless through 6 lungs and a prayer wheel. "Mark all of that." Sporefall slackened as the sky ran out of bad ideas, or paused to invent better ones. The battlefield shredded under the same boredom it produced. The brood nodes at the shelf edge, starved of fresh command and dragged by a gyre they couldn't bully, tore free and went down to be processed into geology. Feeder gantants that had learned to mouth kelp roots discovered you cannot eat your way out of tide. "Contacts reducing," the captain said, voice smoky with used-up adrenaline. "By the throne, it's working." "It was always going to work," the Inquisitor said, but it sounded like she was letting herself enjoy being surprised. He tempered the gyre, unwound it into 3 storms that could be fed back to the ocean as weather, instead of kept as weapon. He went down to the brood churn where the water still tasted like patent leather, and told it, with the trident's hum and his own breath, that there is a way things are here, and the way is named Pelagia. The sea listened. It has always liked being reminded of itself. In the aftermath, the work changed. It wasn't battle. It was housekeeping on a violent scale. He guided scavengers to the places where biomass would rot wrong if left to its routines. He carved channels for currents to flush brood stink out of domes without poisoning the plankton that fed children. He set eel schools to hunt down the last rags of synapse impulse trapped in jellyfish that didn't deserve to be haunted. He stood on the surface a while and talked to the wind about not bringing the storms back too soon. The wind grumbled and went elsewhere. Reports began to crystallize around the event, as Imperial reports do, frosting its edges with classifications and proper nouns. Pelagia Prime, Thalassic Theatre, Duskfall Engagement. Casualties were assessed in numbers and devotions. Abnormalities were stamped and shelved. In a corner of the bridge, where the light did not reach, the pale-eyed sister signed to him once. Useful. He returned a crooked hand that meant likewise. He did not feel triumphant. The Tyranids teach the same lesson every time. If you win, you have only bought time for your grandchildren. He swam the trenches one last loop and listened to the bruise their presence had left behind. He could feel the swarm's mind already reshaping the experience into a better next time. The ocean thrummed under him, turning panic into memory, the way it turned shipwrecks into reefs. Above, the Inquisitor faced the hololith, the Margos at her shoulder. "First time I've played Admiral to a hurricane," the captain said, half to herself. "Adaptation is worship," the Margos murmured, which might have been a joke or a sin. The Inquisitor did not smile. Send word, spin word, and rim word. Every ocean world will feel them, and sooner or later. Tell them what we did with the water. They will not have him. They can have the method. Will they understand it? The captain asked. They will if they drown once, the Inquisitor said, and then to him through the open vox. What do you call this? He watched the gyre ease itself into weather, like a giant returning to sleep, and said, listening. Can we do it again? She asked. He looked at the sky, at the bruised horizon, at the tidal rivers settling their shoulders after the hard work of being weapons. He thought of the brood mind, already sketching amphibious titans with different ribs, baffles that hum instead of absorb, worms that eat leverage instead of kelp. Yes, he said, until they learn a new song. The survivors lit lamps along the kelp lattice, and the lamps' glow braided into a quiet procession that ran from dome to dome. The bell inside the main city tolled, once, twice, 3 times. Grief, relief, a promise. He stood in the wash of that sound and let it travel through him into the water. Kings are vessels. So are oceans. Night finally came, black and clean. The sea breathed like a great animal that has decided to live another day. He listened, and the water told him something he had not expected to hear in this galaxy. Thank you. Not in words, in the way it arranged its rest. Word spread the way it always does at sea, through rumor carried by wind and wake, through the quiet gossip of currents. The Pelagian flotillas stitched their corridors back together. The Navy catalogued wreckage into virtue. The Margos wrote hymns to Data with a trembling stylus, and a message ran down the gyre lanes into the dark. Something new had stood with a world of water, and the world had stood back. The first to answer wore silence like a tide mark. They arrived without fanfare, grey on grey, hulls scarred into anonymity, heraldry eaten by salt and war. The Carcharodons descended as if they had always been there, shadows resolving into armored men the size of altars, eyes as pale as drowned skies behind visors. They came by boarding torpedoes and blackened drop barges that skipped once on the swells and then sat like sharks at rest. When their boots met the kelp lattice, nothing flexed. Everything paid attention. He met them on the water because anything else would have been disrespect. The tallest of them stepped forward, shoulders like bulkheads, armor studded with teeth and memory. A chain hung at his throat, threaded by a single enormous tooth, carved with tiny cuts that were not decoration so much as history. The Space Marine did not speak first. He inhaled, as if tasting the air for lies, then turned his helmeted head to take in the kelp corridors, the domes, the scars on the pylons, the way the waves deferred to the man with the trident. He looked back, and the two of them stood like stones in a river, while the river decided how to go around them. "You made weather work," the Marine said at last, his voice a slow surf on rock. "We respect those who move things bigger than themselves." "It moved because it wanted to be what it was," he said. "I asked." It agreed. The Marine considered that answer like a bone. Then he unthreaded the tooth and offered it up in his great hand. "Token," he said. "From a void shark we hunted between stars. We keep the ones that change our doctrine." He took the tooth. It was etched with tiny lines that, close up, were not cuts so much as notation, a map of motion written by someone who cared about learning. He set the trident's tines against the tooth, hummed, and the marks sang back their meaning to him. Current, mass, timing. A kill earned only by patience. He nodded. "I'll keep your lesson," he said. The Marine grunted approval. "We are Carcharodons," he said. "We do not join. We drift. Sometimes we coincide. Often we bite. Today we coincide." "Welcome," he said, and that was enough. The next arrivals wore robes that had learned blue from water and red from Mars, and made a theology out of their compromise. The Hydra Mechanicus came down in sub-templum walkers that touched sea like pilgrims touching saints. They exhaled incense that made the gulls fall quiet. Their Magos was not the same one who had named him Engineer of Reality. This one was older, with gill-like vents along his flanks that opened and closed in liturgical rhythm. He bowed to the ocean first, and the men later. "We have relics that want to be under pressure," the Magos intoned, the words swimming through the machine cant behind them. "Organs that sing better when wet. We will sanctify your trenches and teach your chimneys new hymns. In exchange, we will listen to what they know. The trenches do not keep secrets from those who ask respectfully," he said. The Magos smiled, a series of clicks behind a faceplate. "Then we will be very respectful." They unpacked devotions that never see daylight. Vox boys carved to copy the tone of migrating whales. Salinity altars made of old ship bones and brass. An organ whose pipes were transparent and ribbed like cuttlefish shells, which they called the Tide Choir. When the choir played its first note, the water around Pelagia sighed for a mile. He tuned his trident to the choir the way a man tunes a knife to a whetstone. The Aeldari did not arrive. They revealed themselves, which is almost the opposite. One evening, when the wind had gone honest and the waves wore only their own weight, skiffs slid out from behind mathematics and hung there like fragments of moonlight. Men reached for weapons, and the sisters tightened into winter. He lifted a hand, and everything waited. They sent a woman to speak, a corsair with knives that wanted their own names and a gaze like blown glass. Her armor was a story written in curves and cruelty, but her hands were empty. "We have heard," she said in perfect low Gothic, "that you taught a storm to dance for you." "I taught a storm to dance for us," he said, and watched her weigh the pronoun. Her mouth tipped. "We have ocean worlds too," she said softly. "We have had them, lost them, drowned them on purpose so our ghosts would be quiet. You call the sea a choir. We call it a veil. It keeps certain hungers from smelling us. You and I might trade words." She glanced toward the sisters, who stared at her across a vacuum abhorred by sound. "If you can keep your winter from turning the talking into confession." The Inquisitor was there, because the Inquisitor was behind every door that mattered, whether merely in person or in permission. She spoke without moving, as if her words had been here first, and were just now stepping into the light. Terms of parley. Open scipo, open sea. No soul stones broken, no wards pried. My winter stands down to weather. If you turn weather into storm, we drown you. We drink air, the Corsair said mildly. We understand weather. They met on a platform bolted to a pylon that had known barnacles and boots. The sisters fell back far enough that the pressure in his ears stopped whining and settled into the steady tinnitus of being alive. The Corsair considered the man with the trident with a soldier's curiosity and something like homesickness. "My people have a chart," she said, drawing a curve in the air with 2 fingers. of rivers in the not water, what you would call the warp, that run beside oceans. Where those rivers run close, the tide tugs at psyches. Sometimes the tug is useful. Sometimes it drowns. We have learned to sail those seams. You have learned to compel them. I listened, he said. The sea wants to be asked. She glanced toward the Hydromechanicus's tide choir, where adepts in wet blue sang machine cant that sounded like prayer through a mouthful of salt. Humans usually only ask their gods. It is novel to see them ask their world. What do you want? The Inquisitor asked, as if she were polite only when it cost nothing. A pact, the Aeldari said. We can show you lanes that will keep your ships from being tricked by hungry currents. You can keep your nails and your torches off certain gulfs where our dead sleep. In between, we drown those who deserve it. Define deserve, the Inquisitor said. The Aeldari's eyes flicked toward the children learning to swim in the lee of a pylon, toward the custodians tracing rust off devotional plaques, toward a reef back lifting its head to listen to the tide choir, toward the grey giants who did not move unless movement mattered. Those who would harvest a mind that did not offer itself, she said. He nodded. That is a good definition. They argued in the way seafarers argue, over cargo and course, salvage and sanctuary, rescue and jurisdiction, mercy and its limits. The Margos proposed a litany of acceptable warming discharges and a set of pressure codes to identify sanctuaries. The Corsair countered with soul tides, places where grief lays heavy enough to break depth gauges and turn compasses honest, and suggested they be marked on human charts with a symbol no one would mistake for a garnish. The Inquisitor pressed for rights of inspection. The Carcharodon cut the argument short by stepping to the platform's edge and letting himself fall backward into the green. When he surfaced, he said, through a mouthful of water, "Make the rules, or we drown while discussing them." They wrote them. They called it the Thalassic Pact because the word sat well in the mouth and tasted like old oaths. It was not one document, but many. A net of agreements dragged out into space. On Pelagia, they inked it into vellum made from weed and waxed into letters that would survive a century of damp. On a frigate's bridge, they etched it into brass. In a Hydromechanicus sanctum, they recorded it in machine cant and hid it in a choke valve so that every exhale reminded the engine under it of obligation. The Corsairs inscribed it into a bead of glass and wore that bead at a throat as if it were a small moon. The Carcharodons carved it into scrimshaw and handed the scrimshaw from hand to hand until everyone's skin remembered it. The terms were practical. Share current charts and storm habits. Mark sanctuaries where no net will be thrown and no sonar will shout. Bear a common rescue code. 3 pulses long, 2 short, 3 long. No matter the language of the hull. Admit that some whales are citizens. Forbid toxins that do not forget the harm they do. Hunt the raiders who harvest humans with hooks and the ones who harvest souls with science. Greet any ship that joins a battle on the side of the pact with courtesy until it earned anything else. It contained a line that belonged to him. No fleet shall starve a world. When he spoke it aloud, men who had never agreed with a Xenos in their lives agreed with that. Skeptics came. They always come. A confessor stormed up a pylon, robes wound around his shins to keep them out of the wet, and declared all alliances with alien hands to be a betrayal of an emperor who had drowned for humanity. The Inquisitor listened as if to weather, and then recited from memory a writ of exceptional necessity. The confessor kept shouting. The sisters stood, winter made human, metal a whisper away. He stepped between them and the priest. "You're angry because the sea kept someone alive without your permission," he said quietly. "Here is how you bless that. By keeping the next someone alive along with it." The confessor saw he would gain no crowd and went away to teach anger to the ones who wanted it. Others stayed, void-tough captains with hands like rope and faces carved by wind, who learned the gospel of the Gaia that the Inquisitor ordered written. Hydra masons who could fold resin into cathedrals underwater with one long, patient exhale. Children who could balance on a rope of kelp while carrying a basket of praying barnacles without dropping either. A sister who watched without blinking and taught him to speak with his hands in her language of distances and decrees until he could joke with her without sound. The first test of the pact came too quickly and in the wrong key. Dark silver hooks glinted over Hydrafour's main lanes, raiders smelling weakness and commerce in the same breath, while orc freebooters came in with their own interpretation of piracy, all noise and appetite. The Navy deployed in doctrinal triangles. The Hydra Mechanicus sank organ buoys at the mouths of the storm lanes and tuned them to sing low morals into the water. The Carcharodons vanished and were suddenly behind the lead cruiser, and the Corsairs folded in from an angle that made the Void feel a little seasick. He was not built for vacuum. He is what he is. But even the Void has tides if you look for gravity long enough, and ships swim when you stop insisting they don't. He stood in a hangar bay, open to the wrong kind of dark, and set his trident to the deck. The ship hummed. He asked the pilot currents to tighten when the orc cannons belched, and the waves of force widen when the Navy needed room to breathe. In the lanes, the organ buoys sang a note that made torpedo wakes remember they wished to be corkscrews. Orc gunners got drunk on frustration. The Corsairs darted like flies in a cathedral, insulting physics as a matter of principle. A Carcharodon teleported into a boarding corridor with a chain blade that had eaten too many names and took the argument out of it. None of that was the important part. The important part was the convoy. The important part is always the people who never wanted to be important. The convoy lay between pirates and profit, lives and the example of easy prey. The pact worked like a net upside down. The Navy pulled. The Corsairs pushed. The sharks bit. He angled emptiness into curves that made shells glance off hulls, and in those tiny deviations, lives fit. On the deck of a fat tanker of grain, a child beat a frying pan with a spoon, 3 pulses long, 2 short, 3 long, and every ship that heard it remembered the code and came to meet it with steel and promise. They won, which is to say, they bled, and the enemy bled more, and at the end, there were enough ships left to carry the pact into the next hour. They took the orc cruiser's main gun off by confusing the idea of its recoil with the idea of wind. The weapon fired once and convinced itself it had done so forever. The raiders cut their losses, which looked like murder in reverse, and the Void knew patience again. After Hydrafour came quieter things that weren't less important. The Margos taught the Tide Choir to play with the whale songs in keys that kept migrating schools away from industrial intakes. The Aeldari drew ghost coastlines on human charts and watched the Inquisitor not call them haunted. On a moon of dull ice and black water, he brokered a mercy. A pod of predators with too much clever in their eyes had been teaching itself to unscrew hatches. Custodians wanted to cull them. The Margos wanted to lobotomize, The Aeldari suggested luring them to a deeper feast and letting a leviathan teach them humility. He took the trident to the edge of a trench and had a conversation with a matriarch older than the human empire. The pod learned the shape of a particular shadow and stopped being a problem. No songs, no medals, just a better next season. They founded signal houses on the sea, tower buoys with bells that rang through water and light that crossed fog. He asked the plankton near them to glow a little brighter when fugitive skiffs came out of storm with broken corridors and no faith left. He asked the custodians to feed those lights a handful of copper and a story. The lights obliged. The stories grew. He learned to make truce with the sisters' winter. The pale-eyed one stayed near him when she could, because duty is a quieter word for love, and hers was for her vows. They developed a grammar of hands and glances and place. He signaled to her, "I am going into the cold place where silence eats what I am." She returned, "I will stand where the eating is smaller." Once in a drowned temple of black glass, Necrons rose like knives through oil and began to take rust out of the water, to make it clean and therefore dead. The sister's presence made the Necron mind stutter. His song made their joints argue with themselves. The Hydro-Mechanicus choir played a note that disagreed with math. The Corsairs were there and gone, leaving behind puzzled geometries. The Carcharodons took heads that did not admit to being heads, shrugged, and kept taking. He drew lines that looked like law. Certain fjords on Fenris that the wolves call theirs had to be asked for, and the asking had to be done with respect and ale, and a promise not to tell sagas about warriors who do not want help. He went anyway when a green tide came in on a raft of junk and found that even wolves listen when their island's bones creak. He told the storm, "Slow." Witnesses say they saw a man hold a gale in his hands like bread dough. Witnesses lie about details when the truth is too simple. On a world with too much sky and too little water, the Tau tried to seed the desert with floating factories that milked the vapor out of wind. It worked for them. It harmed everything else. He met their water-caste envoy, soft-voiced, careful, carrying a cup in offering, and told her plainly, "Yours is an intelligent plan that kills what I have sworn." She offered adaptation. He suggested moving their towers downwind of certain ecologies and taught their engineers 3 wind tricks in exchange for leaving a salt lake alone. The Inquisitor called it heresy, and then filed it under exceptions, provisional. Not every ask found a yes. Drukhari came on black sails that cast shadows like migraines and offered pain flavored with wit. He sank their boats until wit drowned. Corsairs flinched at how much like them the Drukhari were, and then flinched at having flinched. The Pact learned the difference between a knife that cuts food and a knife that cuts faces. He made sanctuaries, places that belonged to water more than to anyone else. They had names like the Slough, where whales teach their calves, the Cathedral, where vents write steam scripture in bone fonts, the Mirror, where fish with sky in their blood rise once a year to look at the surface and remember the best and worst thing about being alive. No sonar, no harvest, no arguments. The Navy put them on charts. The Corsairs steered wide. The Carcharodons swore in their own way, which sounded like not much and lasted like rock. He adjudicated human squabbles with the same patience he gave to storms. 2 Pelagian domes fell into a fight over who had a right to follow a certain migrating fish and capture it reverently. He listened to both terribly convincing histories and then asked the fish, which had a habit of rubbing its sides against pillars that tasted of iron. The fish liked the pillars because of the iron. He set a time for the migration to pass the far dome, first by seeding iron a mile out, and a time later for it to pass the other. Both domes called him biased. He called it calendar. The Hydromechanicus took the mumbled mathematics he made out of weather and wrote them clean, built instruments to reproduce parts of it when he could not be two places at once, codified emergency counter-gyre formats into litany and interface, and named them for saints that had never seen the sea. He played the tide choir with them and learned which ratios made children's ears ache and which made them grin. He grew used to the smell of oil and brine together. When he slept on the water. It held him. The trident hummed in his hand, even at rest. In his dreams, he walked a seabed that belonged to no star map he had learned, and palaces of coral taller than hive towers grew in silence, and ghosts that had never been human flickered in the corners of vision. Once a wave of cold went through the dream world that was not weather. He woke tasting iron and rot, and the Inquisitor's vox was already whispering the word, plague. Before that next wave, there was a night when the pact gathered to look at each other and admit they had made something. They met on a platform hung with lamps and draped with nets that still smelled of kelp. The Margos set out small cups of filtered seawater. The Corsair poured something clear into hers that turned the water the color of moon. The Carcharodon drank nothing and did not mind. The sisters stood back, winter and duty, and something like respect. He spoke last because someone had to. "This is not a treaty," he said. "Treaties are for people who are sure of their borders. We made a promise instead. Promises have to be kept while you're tired and sorry and hungry. They have to be kept when they cost." The Inquisitor's mouth made a shape that might have been a smile if seen from a distance. The Hydromechanicus recorded his words in the choir's pipes, a ghost of sound that would play back whenever the right notes were struck. The Corsair touched her glass bead, and for a second he saw, reflected small and perfect, a fleet that had drowned itself to become a story. The Carcharodon put a hand the size of a keel on the platform's edge and said, "We will coincide again." Later, alone on the black glass shore where he had first stood, he pressed the trident into the sand and let its hum run down into the bedrock and out into the sea, a reminder, a declaration, a vow. Far off, bells answered. Closer by, a sister's winter eased for a heartbeat. Underfoot, something huge and old yawned in contentment. From the maelstrom to the rim, from fjords, a wolf once named to lanes, a governor calls his. From the aquifer moons, no one charted to the harbors everyone wants. Word went out in Tid and Swa and rumor. If you poison your ocean, if you harvest a mind that didn't offer itself, if you take without asking, a coalition with teeth and patience will find you. If you fall out of your corridor into cold water and pray to anyone who isn't listening, a bell will ring and someone will come. The pact did not solve hunger. It did not quiet the gods. It set a practice. In a galaxy that confuses power with permission, practice is a miracle you can repeat. The vision did not arrive as light. It arrived as pressure. He was standing chest deep in Pelagia's low-tide dusk. The trident sunk into sand that had learned his weight, when the sea backed away from his knees as if making room. The tide paused its breathing, held itself perfectly, between in and out. In that held breath, He felt a second ocean press against the first, vast, dry, hungering, patient. It did not come from above or below. It came from everywhere at once. A choir tried to die in his teeth. The astropaths on the frigate were singing with the kind of discipline that keeps a mind from being carried off by its own echo. Between their notes, he heard the scrape of something bigger, a throne being dragged across a stone floor, a god being nailed to useful work forever. The pressure flattened the surface of the water in front of him until it was mirror smooth and black. His reflection did not show. Something else did. There was a man on a chair made of knives and wires and history. The chair ate him for the good of everyone who would never thank him properly. He had eyes like burnt holes in a map, and hands that remembered warm things, and around him moved a machinery of devotion that could not imagine another way to live. In the air thrummed a single command: endure. He tasted deserts he had never walked. He tasted rivers murdered into roads. He tasted worlds where oceans had been boiled for fuel, vaporized for strategy, sanctified into scarcity, so that faith would have a number to attach to thirst. He saw oceans that still lived and heard how little time they had. He felt, for a heartbeat, the Emperor's Wahasauster's will as it rubbed along the ridges of the galaxy, making sparks where it met anything too soft to be useful. The vision turned its face and became another tide. Rot smiled. Teeth softened. Rust learned to breathe. He saw hulls blistering with plagues that wore cute names, saw bells ringing in fogs that made the lungs feel beloved in their ruin, saw sailors lullabied into vomiting up strings of pearls that begged to be swallowed again. He saw a cruiser rot from the keel up and keep fighting because love is stubborn even when misdirected. He saw a man in corroded Terminator plate, the color of old bile, scythe balanced like an argument that wins by existing. Typhus stirred a cauldron suspended in vacuum, and everything around him learned to mulch. Between those pillars, endurance nailed into a corpse, joy made of infection, sleek ships in alien curves, perfect as knives made by people who still believed elegance could outthink entropy. Aeldari moved along command decks that were easy on the eyes. They watched human tragedy with a love that did not include us. They had buried oceans to hide from their own gods and called it wisdom. They were right, and it did not save them. The vision showed him their veils, their lanes in the not water, their careful hunger for survival. When he could breathe around it, when the trident's hum told him the world had not changed under his feet, he said aloud to the vision, to the throne, to the rot, to the grace, no. The word did not echo. It sank and found bottom. The choir on the frigate faltered for half a beat, as if surprised to be refused so directly, and then steadied again. The smooth water rucked itself back into wave and came home to his knees. The pressure eased, but it left a bruise that knew Terra's name and would not forget it. He did not sleep. He walked the black glass shore and listened to the difference between silence and quiet. The sisters knew the difference instinctively. The pale-eyed one stepped out of the weather at some point and took up station 2 arm spans away, because duty and affection can share a body without admitting it. He signed, "Something came." She answered, "Many things are always coming." He signed again, slower. "This one asked me to kneel." She did not blink. Then she made a shape with her hands he had not learned yet, a gesture made of angles and refusal. It meant, "We kneel to our oaths." He woke the Inquisitor with a word through the vox that navigated her sleep like a knife through cloth. She came in a cloak that might have been a blanket for someone else. She leaned on the rail and watched the tide make arguments with the rocks. "What did you see?" "Thirst," he said, and a man keeping a promise so hard it turned him into a warning. "And?" she asked. "And rot," he said, made cheerful. "We call that hope," she said dryly, meaning the first. "And the second we call blasphemy, unless it's useful." "I'm not a weapon," he said. "You're a lever," she said, as if correcting a child's math. "The difference is mostly rhetoric." He put the trident in the wet sand, and it sang a note the ship did not know how to record. "If I am a lever, I need a fulcrum that isn't any of you." "Name it," she said. He could have chosen an old god from an old world and bent this place's superstitions around it. He could have said a king's name and demanded fealty. He did something harder. "I'll give you an oath," he said. "Not to you. To the sea, and to anyone who draws life from water without hating it." She tasted the word oath like a person tasting the edge of a blade. "Say it aloud," she said. "Make it cost you in breath." He put his palm flat on the tide. The sea read his hand, and he felt the long, cold mouth of the trench listen. He spoke into that listening. "First," he said, "no demon shall foul a living ocean while I still draw breath. I will unmake what cannot be washed and drown what can be drowned. Second, no fleet shall starve a world. I will fight embargo with weather and hunger with current, and I will teach the wind to carry grain where guns would prefer it not. Third, the drowned belong to the sea. I will not harvest their memory for profit or for fear. I will keep their names in silence until the sea forgets them on its own. Fourth, sanctuaries shall stand. There will be waters where nothing hunts, and if anything hunts there, I will teach it a different appetite. Fifth, if you call with 3 long, 2 short, 3 long, I will come, no matter your flag, unless you have lied with that call before. Sixth, I will treat the smallest tide pool as kin to the widest gyre. No machine, no right, no war will be allowed to make a puddle into poison. Seventh, no mind shall be netted. If you would take a creature's song, you will ask it to sing. If it has no word for yes, your answer is no. Eighth, and here his voice thinned as if the world pressed on his chest by habit. I will speak for water when water cannot speak, and I will listen when it can. I will be a steward, not a master. If I break these, may the sea forget me. The sisters Winter edged at the word steward and did not cut it. The Hydra Mechanicus choir, asleep in its pipes, sighed. The Carcharodons, who had never pretended to be poets, marked the cadence and filed it in their bones. The Corsair, who had the gift of hearing promises the way other people hear lies, smiled like a person who had found a road where there had been only cliff. The Inquisitor watched his mouth move and measured the world with it. 8, she said. You choose 8? 8 winds, 8 great gyres, 8 currents that circle every ocean if you watch long enough, he said. It's a good number for water. She did not tell him what else 8 belonged to. She did not need to. The sisters knew. The Margos knew. The Void knew. The oaths weren't theirs. They were his. That was the point. The ripple started immediately. Cults bud like barnacles on any hull left in the water. Within a day, a woman who had lost a child and found him again on the kelp lattice tied a strip of sea silk around a post and whispered his name to the tide. Within 2, a confessor scraped together a dozen citations about false saints and said them loudly, with little breaths between each, so he would not faint. Within 3, a Magos drew a machine oath from the 8 and called it the Hygromantic Protocol, a set of rituals to command pumps and purifiers to imitate his notes. Within 4, a child placed a toy trident in a bucket and demanded the bucket behave. It did, once. He tried to stamp none of it. He set a rule. You may thank the sea. You may thank those who serve it. If you thank me, do it by feeding something hungry that is not yourself. The Inquisitor allowed it because it cost her nothing and cost him much. The first answer to the oath was rot. Word came from Threnodi's belt. 12 aquifer moons around a gas giant, their seas mined like veins in a saint's arm for water to export to dusty tyrannies. The message smelled wrong in the vox, sweet as a lie told to a child. Boil order enacted, the governor declared, voice thick with denial. Containment is assured. Do not approach. Do not approach. We are blessed. Bells clanged behind his words. The wrong bells. Bells that confuse pulse with rhythm until you stop being careful. The Inquisitor's look crossed the bridge like a shadow. Typhus, she said, or something that loves him. He went because the 8 did not allow him to ignore disease, and because the belt's oceans were the kind that get turned into currency and never grow legendaries of their own. The convoy that formed around his decision looked like an argument that had learned manners. The frigate that had first watched him, now with bells that rang the pact pattern. 2 Carcharodon strike craft, grey on grey. Hydromechanicus barges dragging sanctified desalination rigs. 3 Corsair skiffs that arrived where space said they shouldn't, and a single Navy hospital ship whose chaplain had the kind of hands that know how to count to 10 on a baby's back. They arrived into a darkness that had learned to float. Spores of light bobbed on the black. They looked like lanterns at a seaside festival until one of them struck a buoy and turned it into a soft mouth. The moons gleamed the way fruit gleams when it is already rotten under the skin. On the lead moon, bridges of resin straddled canals that had been emerald last year and were now oil. Statues of saints had pustules. Flocks of gull analogues flew drunk and fell into the water laughing open beaks. The first landing party returned without their sense of smell and wept about it while they scrubbed and couldn't feel clean. The sisters' winter didn't so much suppress the warp as make it feel unwelcome. Nurgle is nothing if not hospitable. Hospitality is a weapon if you sharpen it with time. He made camp at the mouth of a canal where someone had built a shrine to safe voyages that was busy melting into a smile. The Hydromechanicus unpacked the choir and bent over it like surgeons around a child. The Corsairs ranged and came back with the kind of intelligence that cannot be drawn on maps, where fear puddled, where resignation had found a chair, where courage had collected knives. The Carcharodons walked the docks like avalanches in armor, and people gave them a berth out of instinct that had nothing to do with reason. He walked to the water and tasted it. Under the rot, the sea remembered itself. It clung to identity the way a wound clings to scab. He put the trident in and hummed a note that said, "What you are is older than this." The water shivered. It began to arrange itself around his definition the way iron filings arrange around a magnet. The infection did not die. It is too good at not dying. But the water stopped loving it. Death Guard came. Of course they did. Rot loves to attend its own parties. They moved through the infected air like men walking into a memory they had enjoyed. They were accompanied by things that had once been sailors, and now were parables about poor hygiene. The Death Guard's bolters made wet sounds. Their tanks wept like mothers. Their champion carried a bell that rang the word, "Stay," in 100 small ways. The sisters met them with hearth cold that turned the bell's toll into a reminder rather than a compulsion. The Carcharodons stepped into the space that opened and made an art of inevitability. He kept his hands in the canal because war already had enough hands, and this war's center was not on a causeway. It was in the liquid that would carry this sickness to thirsty worlds if he failed. He called for pressure. The vents under Threnody were weak. These moons had been written not by tectonics, but by commerce. But pressure is not only geology. He stacked wind over sea, over wind, until the surface was a machine. He used the choir to pull a note out of the infection, found the pitch where it liked to be itself, and then played its fifth and seventh, harmonies that made the thing itch. The Hydromechanicus beat that itch into their intake valves and began to drink the wrongness faster than it could be poured. The Corsairs dragged a chain of bells across the main bay, copper, not sanctified, tuned to the scream of the parasites that wore sailor voices. The bells did not ring in air, they rang in water. Parasites left hosts to get away from the ringing and found waiting nets. The nets were made of kelp that remembers what it is to be a hand. The Death Guard champion reached him on the key. He could smell him without breathing. The bell rang a story about how rest is the only mercy. The champion lifted his scythe and said, through a speaker clogged with moss, "Why fight a tide that carries everyone?" He did not look up. "Because it would carry those who are not done yet," he said, "and because if rest is not a choice, it is not mercy." He asked the water between them to be absent for as long as it takes for a heavy man to overextend. The scythe cut a line through nothing, and in that lurch time, when even rot remembers balance, a Carcharodon stepped in and removed the part of the champion that did the thinking. The bell fell into the canal and sank politely. The water did not ring. Typhus did not come in person. Some men understand delegation, but his cauldrons came. In the black under the moons, great vats turned slowly, each an ecosystem of boiling love. The vats were not attached to ships. They were attached to ideas. The vats fed the tide. The tide fed the vats. He could feel the circle, feel its smugness. He did not have a gun big enough to argue with it. He had something worse. He taught the moon's faint thermal veins how to harmonize on a single, patient pulse. He taught the choir to match it and then to lag it by a hair, then the wind to match the lag and exceed it by a hair again, then the tides to match the exceeding and undercut it by something you could not write down. The circle found itself correcting constantly. If rot is anything, it is a lover of stasis. It fumbled, glitched, slowed. The vats grew less confident in their boiling. The sea put on the face of someone who is bored of a conversation. The sisters moved through the city like weather that is tired of being kind. People who had been clinging to the edges of their own bodies felt something close to relief, and then, terrified of hope, waited for punishment. It didn't come. The pale-eyed sister stood in a square where the statues cried fat tears and held up both hands and signed, big enough for ignorant eyes to learn, "Clean now." He turned valves that were more ritual than machine. The Hydromechanicus pushed steam through pipes not meant to carry prayers and made them do it anyway. The Corsairs stole a play from the Drukhari and used pain against pain. They took a neighborhood that had learned to enjoy vomiting and turned the joy into nausea about itself. The Carcharodons dragged chains across the docks and pulled up whatever had learned to hold on. The Navy hospital ship put its hull between two neighborhoods and refused to move until each agreed to feed the other soup. By dawn on the fourth day, the water was still wrong, but wrong in a tired way. The buoy lanterns had dimmed. The gull analogues slept with their beaks shut. The bells only rang for weather. The vats in the black had either been dragged through a seam to somewhere the sea refused to think about, or sank under a slow logic. The Death Guard withdrew like mold from a cleaned corner. Offended but philosophical, there was always another loaf. The governor, who had declared everything blessed, stood on a balcony without his face on. He had learned the lesson bureaucracy always learns last, that lies do not erase the event, only your right to attend it. He started a speech. The Carcharodon nearest him put a hand on his shoulder the size of a decree and shook his head once. The speech drifted away like an ash that had decided against being flame. They left autoclaves behind, and protocols that would make water remember how not to love infection, and a choir score whose first line read, "If you feel like singing, you are not dying." The pact moved on. It had to. The belt would take years to forget what had been asked of it. Years count in this century as victory. He did not call the vision back. The vision did not need invitation. In warp weather, something always looks back at those who look. When he slept, he dreamed of a throne and a man who had been reduced to function, and of bells ringing with laughter that forgives everything because it enjoys everything. He woke and said no again. He said it like breath. It is how oaths survive. Repetition when nothing is listening. The ripple reached places he would never see. A clerk on a world with canals wrote a note in a ledger. No harvest on the Eel Bend during late autumn by the Thalassic. A rogue trader printed the Pact's rescue code on the inside of lifeboat hatches because there was no profit in letting good stories drown. A wolf on Fenris taught a pup that whales are older than gods, and that gods get their age from whales. An Aeldari maiden in a ship that had lost its craft world ran her fingers along a hololith of lanes that were not water, but felt like it, and whispered a thank you to someone who would never hear it. A Margos drowned a machine that wanted to desalinate blood and said a prayer for what it could have been. There were fights. There would always be fights. A forge tyrant tried to dam an estuary and sell the rain back to a city. He woke in a cold bed with 20 tons of eel in his courtyard, and a legal writ pinned to its side, signed by 100 hands, some of them not human. A black ship, confused and wounded, drifted too near a soul tide, and the sisters asked him, without asking, to make the water forget for an hour. He did and did not like how easily the forgetting fit in his hands. A tow-water cast envoy returned with engineers who had learned to be careful with clouds. They toasted to a thing that served both empire and ocean, and no one reported them because every mouthful of air felt like good work. It changed him. All oaths do, if they're working. He had thought himself a king. Kings collect obedience and leave gratitude for later. A steward collects problems and leaves glory alone. He found himself listening more than speaking, tuning more than striking. He learned to say no to people he liked, and yes to people who disgusted him, because the math was not for him. He watched the Inquisitor make compromises that would have been called sins if written by any other hand. He watched her learn to say the word steward without it catching in her throat. He watched the pale-eyed sister watch him, and once when she thought no one watched her, shape with her hands the sign for safe. News came that did not have the decency to be surprised. Typhus had not stopped. Why would he? He was a river with legs. Rot is patient. On a rusted Vox channel that no one admitted to keeping open, a bell rang as if submerged. A voice that liked itself too much said, "We turn seas into gardens." He looked at the trident, at the knives of its tines and the music they held. He looked at the pact, at the choirs and the sharks and the elves and the winter and the nets and the bells and the domes and the children who now beat frying pans against railings in the right code without thinking about why. And he felt the Emperor's bruise in his bones again. Endure. The word had felt like a chain once. It felt like a tide now. He stood where the sea could hear him best, on the line where waves decide if they are going to be sky or stone. He set the trident and let its hum go down into sand and coral and bedtime stories. He spoke not to terror or to plagues or to pretty ships in pretty silence, but to the thing that had carried him, the first teacher he had. He spoke to water. "I will not kneel," he said. "I will bend when bending saves. I will break when breaking saves. I will forgive when the sea forgives. I will not forget for you. I will not remember lies, because they are beautiful. I will be here when the bells ring wrong, and when the bells ring right, and when there are no bells at all. I will be here when rot smiles, and when endurance forgets why it is doing the work. I will be here when the wind falls. I will be here when it rises." The tide took the vow and distributed it into small labors. Rain remembered it over a field 3 months later and chose to fall straight for once. A rivulet remembered it and cut the long way around a cemetery because the short way would have hurried bones. A ship's cook remembered it and boiled water twice before giving it to a scared boy, because fear makes your body bad at telling the truth about temperature. The sea is a courier that does not tire. Far away, under a ceiling of gold that had been made to look like sky for people who had forgotten actual sky, men argued about him in voices dressed like law. Words like heresy and asset and saint and threat made a crab-like scuttle across polished floors. The Inquisitor sent a parchment that did not bow and called it precedent. A small cult somewhere made a wreath of salt grass and promised it would only be a wreath. A larger cult somewhere else carved his face into a cliff, and the cliff slumped 2 days later because cliffs do not like being made into mouths. He kept moving. The pact sailed, walked, hummed, glided, dove. They failed often in ways that everyone survives, and succeeded rarely in ways that no one sings about, because the song takes too long. He learned the names of storms that never appeared on charts. He learned which saints liked to be invoked before the wind, and which after. He learned how to tell a whale that a ship with a loud propeller will not mean to hurt it, and to tell a captain that meaning is not the only measure of harm. He learned to count to 8 slowly, and mean it each time. And somewhere in a ship that smelled of old iron and sweet rot, a man in sick brown armor scraped his scythe along his palm and laughed. He set another vat to boil. He whispered to a moon, "When you go soft, you can be shaped." He whispered to a tide, "When you go slack, you can be pulled." He whispered to a world, "When you are tired, I am home." He did not hear, because he did not listen. A bell ring 3 long, 2 short, 3 long, far away, and a practice begin again.